Today I'm speaking as a parent, and a lot of the things that I realized I did with my children, perhaps at the time that I did it, I wasn't aware of the theory or the kind of research behind it. So I was doing it more in terms of like reading about it, getting my students to write, etc. Because I was an English teacher, I really wanted my children to enjoy language like I did. And what I find as I look at a lot of children's writing now is that it's become very run-of-the-mill. You know, they get very, there's the kind of like a template kind of writing that has happened. And sadly, I think the PSLE exam has also reinforced this, because you find that kids have to learn word lists, or they have got these phrases that they think that's like the magic bullet that you're going to get kind of thing, right? So that is essentially, it's not what I'm talking about. And what I'm talking about is getting your children to really like enjoy writing. Right. So I'm going to share with you some of the pieces that my children did as well. I have two daughters. My oldest is 26 now. My second one is 22. So the pieces that I have, they were growing up in the early 90s, at which point I didn't have as much of the digital resources that you all have now. I also have another caveat to add, and that is at the point where I did the PowerPoint, because you know we have to send it out to the printers and so on. Since then, I've been like refining it. So you might find that some of my slides don't follow the thread, okay? And if you want to clarify anything, or you feel that you are not following my presentation, feel free to just like ask me along the way, okay? Right, so I'm going to keep this really informal, and please do ask questions along the way, okay? And if I can answer, I will. But I really do want to emphasize that bit about this not being PSLE. All right? It's like a huge fear for me. When I saw 120 people turned up, I told my children, I bet 118 of them think this is going to be about PSLE, and then I'm going to die. All right? Which is not. Okay? Okay. Sorry, you just want to find a seat anywhere. That's fine. Okay, so yeah, so I'm currently a master teacher. I was with the, I used to teach after I taught for a very long time. I went in the Ministry of Education, so I was involved with syllabus work, curriculum work and exam work, and then now I've moved on to become a master teacher, so I train teachers of English. So not before they qualify. After they qualify, they're in the schools and they come to me for in-service training. Right? So that's what my institution does. It's also an MOE. It's not a private institution, and I don't do tuition. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to basically like address two big questions today. And if I've got time, then I'll be looking at the 6 traits of writing. But I just want to get these two done. Basically, I just want to ask, why is it that some children don't like to write? Why do we have so many reluctant writers? And how can I help, right? How can I help my child to get excited about writing and doing more and more of it, okay? So those are going to be the two big questions that I'm going to answer today. Again, if these are not the two questions in your heart, please leave. I'm fine with that, okay? All right. Okay. This is a Mother's Day card that my daughter sent last year, because it reminded her of a very common occurrence when she was growing up, right? So I think writing is a very natural activity. Sometimes you just have to keep your kids and the pen and the papers away, and I'm sure you recognize that your children went through this stage as well. And it is true, many years from that point, we do look back at it and laugh. But it's a very natural activity, and writing actually starts before many parents recognize it as writing. We begin to think of writing, especially when we start seeing letters forming, or we see a proper sentence being crafted, and then we say, oh, our child is writing. But actually, when the child starts scribbling, it's a very natural activity that the child does. And what essentially happens is that when we talk about the development of language skills, right, we talk about two sets of skills. We talk about the receptive skills, and then we talk about the productive skills. Right? So receptive skills essentially means when the child is receiving language, okay? And I'm sure you've heard of a lot of stories about how children who are brought up in isolation actually cannot speak, cannot talk, right? That's essentially because children learn to produce. They can produce language only when they have received language, all right? So when we say receptive skills, what are these receptive skills? Are essentially listening, right? They listen to language being used, but they also view increasingly today. There's a lot of viewing happening, and you can see that even 2-year-old, 3-year-olds, they're there with their iPad, you know, and I don't know how, but the 3-year-old knows how to do this with her fingers when she touches the iPad, right? Instinctively, they know how to do that, and they know how to do this, okay? Right, and so that is viewing skills, and this is also why you find that kids are hooked on TV, and why it's so difficult for you to get them off the screen, because they're still receiving. A lot of it is a receptive skill. So listening, viewing, and then later reading. All right, so when I say listening, we are also talking about hearing the parents read to the children. All right, and viewing is also when they're viewing not just the words in the book, but also picture books. All right, so you start when you see that the early picture books have got a great deal of viewing pleasure for the child, because the pictures themselves excite the child. Only when the viewing stage has happened, when the receiving stage has happened, does the productive skills start kicking in. May not be linear, may not be one after another, but I'm sure you have all heard stories about, oh, my son didn't talk at all until he was 3, and then he just spoke in complete sentences, right? Basically, the child has been like receiving, and storing and making sense of it. And then the productive phase hits in, and that's when the child starts speaking. And another skill that we don't recognize, which is representing. Representing is when they start drawing. This drawing phase is a very important precursor to the writing stage, because he learns a lot of skills. The representing stage is because the child begins to see pictures, and the child begins to make connections. And that's a very valuable stage for us. And I see a lot of parents take your kids to art classes, and you see a lot of children drawing, etc. But not enough is being made of all those pieces of drawing, because all that drawing that the child does is actually very rich in terms of helping to bridge the child into the writing phase, right? Because representing means the child's beginning to see pictures, he's beginning to appreciate colors, and representing is also a great way for the child to start expressing emotions. All right? And the emotion, the texture, the sense of environment, all of these are important, because when the child starts writing, this is the transference that happens. All right? Increasingly, and if you look, okay, this is the point at which I have to talk about the syllabus. If any of you how many of you are teachers? Okay, fine. Those of you who are teachers, if you look at your English language syllabus, you'll find that the 2010 syllabus actually recognizes the 6 language skills, with representing and viewing being included. Traditionally, we just talked about the 3 R's. Right? We say reading, writing, arithmetic. That has been the traditional presentation. But increasingly, research has showed that we need to look at the viewing and representing. What do you mean by representing? Because you see your kids on the internet all the time. And what is important about the web now is the students can create. Right? Children can go and they can represent. That means they think of ideas and they can create these ideas by film clips. You see the YouTube is full of people putting things up, right? And you can see that there's a lot of software that schools use these days, like Animoto, for example, that helps students create their own digital storytelling. So representing, increasingly we realize that for the 21st century child especially, we need to be thinking of language development in 6 areas. Okay? So the child starts listening, viewing, representing, the receptive skills before the child actually starts writing. May not be linear, but essentially all of that language development is happening. Now, right until the late 19th century, teachers actually acknowledged that speaking, listening and speaking was the precursor to reading and writing. Right? So the connection between speech and writing was very, very, very closely tied, right until the late 19th century. So if you go back and you think about the early 19th century writers or classrooms at that time, they talked about the rhetoric. Right? Rhetoric means the art of reading aloud and persuasive speaking. So people like Plato, Aristotle, etc. Right? There was a lot of speaking the students actually sat there and they learned the art of rhetoric. And what was rhetoric important is because rhetoric gave the learners a ear for language. Right? They begin to listen to cadences of speech, nuances of speech. They begin to hear what we call a ear for language. All of this changed later, especially in the late half of the 19th century. Why? See, before the early 19th century, education was very privileged. Very few people could actually afford education. So classes were small, and teacher-student ratio was very small because it was only the moneyed classes. And then you find that we didn't get the girls into school, etc. So we had a gender bias as well. So classes tended to focus very much on very small class sizes. But late 19th century, you had the universalization of education. With the universalization of education, what happened was mass classes. Right? We started getting mass classes, big classes, and this affected the speaking and writing, the development of rhetoric a great deal, because the teacher just didn't have the time to hear and get your child to be put through the paces of rhetoric. And so a lot of emphasis shifted to reading and writing, because you can still test it in masses. Reading and writing can be tested in masses, you see. So we began to lose this very important connection between speech and writing. And so this is something that was as long ago as the 17th century. Ben Jonson was a very famous poet. And he said, for a man to write well, and the same remains for a child, there are required three necessaries: to read the best authors, to hear the best speakers, and much exercise of his own style. And this is what I'm going to be emphasizing. For your child to write, your child has to read. She has to read best authors. For your child to write, he has to hear. She has to hear the language being used at home, or for you to create opportunities. If you don't have an English-speaking environment at home, you need to create an environment where they hear. And then the last bit, his own style. Not templates, not the list of words that the teacher has given you. His own style is important. In your handouts, I have given you the 6 traits of writing, which I will touch on if I have time. I'm not so sure if I have time, but I'll show you. One of the important 6 traits of writing is voice. Voice basically means not what you hear me saying now, but voice is the personal fingerprint of the child on the writing. Not learned from lists of words, or not something that you memorize, but a voice that develops from the child having a very strong sense of, this is what I feel, and because I feel this, I want to tell you this thing that I feel. And as early as the 17th century, Ben Jonson recognized this. He said the child must, of course he said man, because education at that time was not universal, right? Education was something that only the privileged young men went to. So for a man to write, he must read the best authors. Same remains today. Hear the best speakers. The same remains today. And importantly, much exercise of his own style. Writing and writing and writing till he finds his voice. So, I'm going to introduce to you a language development model, which I hope you will, just in a nutshell, pulling together what happens, right? For the child to develop his language skills, the child usually goes through phases. The first phase that the child goes through is the receptive, listening, right? So the child listens, the child reads, hears words being read, stories being read, and then you will see that your child goes through an imitation phase. The sad thing is if we stop them at the imitation stage. How would we stop them at imitation stage? We will stop them at an imitation stage if you start giving them lists to learn, you give them model essays to read, and then you tell them this is what an A-star essay looks like. If you stop them there, they will always stay at an imitation stage. They will not go on to the other two, which is where the child begins to enjoy. The child begins to enjoy writing when he can innovate and he can invent. Innovate means the imitation stage is necessary. Yeah? There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's very necessary because the child must practice. He must practice how to say it. So they tend to imitate. Okay? Now I'm going to show you. Okay, so this was imitation stage, right? Finish reading Cinderella, and then you get a reproduction of Cinderella. All right, Cinderella sweeps the floor. This is Cinderella's stepsister. She's jealous of Cinderella. Cinderella's stepmother is cruel. They are going to the ball. And then because my child ran out of pages, the end. All right? But that was imitation, nothing new. All right? But you see, this is important because there's a beginning of representation. Having read, she is imitating, she's replicating the same story, all right, but no innovation or invention yet. Okay?